On the 2nd of January, 2024, 379 people walked out of a burning airplane. Every seat was taken. 8 of them were babies. The jet had just struck another aircraft while landing in Tokyo, and within minutes, it was a wall of fire on the evening news in every country on Earth. Every single person on board got out alive. Now hold that picture, because 38 years earlier, the very same airline had put the deadliest single aircraft crash in history into the record books. 520 people, 1 mountain, 4 survivors. That airline is Japan Airlines, the worst disaster the sky has ever seen, and one of its greatest escapes. Both belong to the same red crane on the tail. And between those 2 days, it went bankrupt in the biggest corporate collapse its country had ever seen, then handed the wreck of itself to a retired monk who took no salary at all. So here's the question. How does one airline end up holding both the darkest record in aviation and the brightest? This is the story of how the airline that gave the world its worst day in the air spent the next 40 years turning itself into a name people trust with their lives, and almost died twice on the way there. The collapse, the comeback, the monk, and the 18 minutes on a Tokyo runway that rewrote what everyone thought was possible. To understand the fall, you have to see how high it once flew. It begins in 1951. In a country still rebuilding from war. Japan was not even allowed to have its own airline until that year. When the ban lifted, a small company took to the skies with leased planes and borrowed crews. The very first flight, in October 1951, used an American-built Martin 202 named Mokusei, flown by pilots on loan from abroad because so many Japanese aviators had not survived the war. 2 years later, a new law turned the company into the national flag carrier, the only airline in Japan allowed to fly the world. And fly the world, it did. San Francisco in 1954. A polar route over the Soviet Union in 1970. The first non-Soviet airline ever to run it as a regular service. Round-the-world flights. The airline put a red crane on its tail, a symbol of good fortune and long life in Japan, and that crane became a national badge of pride. Then came the jumbo. Japan Airlines fell in love with the Boeing 747, and it bought them by the dozen, building one of the largest jumbo jet fleets the planet had ever seen. It helped Boeing design the 777. It became the official airline of Tokyo Disneyland. It flew emperors and popes and prime ministers. By the 1980s, this was, by many measures, the #1 airline in the world. The crane on the tail meant power. It meant a nation that had come back from nothing and now owned a piece of the sky. And that is exactly what makes what happened next so hard to tell. On the 12th of August, 1985, Flight 123 left Tokyo for Osaka. It was the evening before Obon, the holiday when Japanese families return home to honor the dead. And the 747 was packed. 524 people. 12 minutes after takeoff, there was a loud bang. A bulkhead at the very back of the aircraft, the wall that seals in the cabin's pressure, tore open. The explosive decompression ripped away most of the tail fin and severed every hydraulic line the jet had. The pilots were left with almost no way to steer. What they did next is still studied by pilots today. For 32 minutes, using nothing but the push of the engines, they fought to keep a crippled jumbo in the air, turning it, holding it, refusing to give up. And then, in the mountains northwest of Tokyo, they ran out of sky. The aircraft struck a ridge. 520 people died. 4 survived, all of them seated near the back. One of them, an off-duty flight attendant who lived to describe what those final minutes were like. It remains, to this day, the deadliest crash of a single aircraft in the history of flight. The cause cut deep. Investigators traced it to a repair, made years earlier after that same plane had scraped its tail on a landing. The fix had not followed the correct method, and over thousands of flights, the weakened metal slowly cracked until it finally failed. A nation was in shock. The airline's president resigned and went in person to bow before grieving families. A maintenance manager took his own life. Every year since, families have climbed that mountain to the markers left in the names of the dead. But something else happened inside Japan Airlines in the years that followed. It did not just absorb the loss. It rebuilt its entire idea of itself around a single promise, that this could never be allowed to happen again. Safety stopped being a department. It became the reason the airline existed. Hold on to that. Because it matters more than anyone could have guessed. For a while, the crane kept flying high. In 1987, the government sold off its shares, and Japan Airlines became a fully private company for the first time. Then it went shopping. In 2002, it merged with Japan Air System, the country's third largest carrier, and overnight, it became the sixth biggest airline on Earth by passengers carried. On paper, it was a giant. Underneath, it was rotting. The airline still behaved like a branch of the government. Decisions crawled through layers of committees. Costs were nobody's problem. Two proud airlines had been bolted together, and the seams never fully closed. It flew a fleet stuffed with thirsty older jumbos on routes that could not fill them, discounting seats it could not sell. It ran hotels and resorts and side businesses that quietly bled money. For years it survived on its size and its name, and the unspoken belief that the flag carrier of Japan was simply too important to fail. Then the world turned. The 2008 financial crisis crushed demand for the premium seats that kept the airline alive. Bullet trains stole its domestic passengers. Fuel prices climbed. The losses stopped being millions and became hundreds of millions of dollars in a single quarter. And on the 19th of January, 2010, the unthinkable happened. Japan Airlines, the national flag carrier, the airline that flew emperors, filed for bankruptcy. It was carrying around 2.3 trillion yen in debt, roughly $25 billion. It was the largest failure of any company in the country's history, outside of a bank. The unsinkable airline had sunk. Everyone assumed this was the end. An airline this size, this broken, does not simply come back. Tens of thousands of jobs were on the line. Morale inside the company had collapsed. The rescue plan was brutal on its own terms. Cut roughly 1/3 of the workforce, around 15,700 jobs, slash salaries, wipe out the shareholders completely, pour in a mountain of public money and forgiven debt. But money alone had failed this airline before. Someone had to walk in and change what the place believed about itself. And the man the government found had never worked a single day in aviation. His name was Kazuo Inamori. He was a retired industrialist in his late 70s, the founder of the electronics and ceramics giant Kyocera, and, of all things, an ordained Buddhist monk. He knew almost nothing about running an airline. He agreed to take the top job on one condition. He would take no salary at all. People thought it was madness. A monk with no aviation experience, running the largest corporate rescue in the nation's history, for free. What Inamori brought was not a fleet plan or a route map, it was a way of thinking. He tore the airline into hundreds of tiny units and made each one responsible for its own profit and loss, so that a station manager or a cabin crew lead could suddenly see in real numbers whether their small corner of the airline made money or lost it. He wrote a philosophy for the company and drilled it into every level, built around one idea he repeated everywhere, that the true purpose of the airline was the happiness of the people who worked inside it. He held study sessions where pilots and mechanics and desk staff sat together and talked about values, not schedules. He was ruthless about the numbers and gentle about the people at the very same time. When he arrived, he was blunt about what he had walked into. He told his managers that if they did not change the way they thought, they would not be able to run a corner grocery store, let alone a national airline. And it worked. It worked faster than anyone alive believed it could. Within 2 years, the airline that had just filed the largest bankruptcy in the country's history became the most profitable airline in the world. In September 2012, less than 3 years after collapsing, Japan Airlines returned to the Tokyo Stock Exchange in a share sale worth around 663 billion yen. That year, the only bigger stock market debut on the entire planet belonged to Facebook. A dead airline had become one of the great comebacks in the history of business. Rivals grumbled that it had been handed an unfair advantage, wiping its debts and its taxes clean in bankruptcy. But the numbers were the numbers, and the monk had done it in under 1,000 days. There is one more detail from those years that says everything. Somewhere along the climb to the top and the long slide back down, Japan Airlines had quietly retired the red crane from its tail, trading its heritage for a more modern corporate look. And then, 1 year to the day after it filed for bankruptcy, the airline announced that the crane was coming home. The Tsurumaru, the circular crane that had meant good fortune and long life since the earliest days, went back onto the tail as a symbol of a fresh start. A company that had almost ceased to exist chose, as its first real statement of survival, to fly its oldest symbol again. The airline that came out the other side was leaner, and it was hungry. Today, Japan Airlines flies a group fleet of roughly 200 aircraft, and it has quietly become one of the most interesting airlines in the sky to watch. For most of its life, it flew almost nothing but Boeing. It was one of the very first airlines in the world to fly the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, and it now operates more than 50 of them. Then, in 2013, it stunned the industry by breaking ranks and ordering 31 Airbus jets, the A350, ending decades of loyalty to Boeing. Its newest flagship, the long and powerful A350-1000, now flies the routes to New York, Los Angeles, and Paris, taking over from the older 777. On shorter routes, a wave of new 737 MAX jets and A321neos is arriving to replace the aging planes. It stayed loyal to the One World Alliance right through the crisis, turning down a rival's rescue offer, and tied itself closer to American Airlines across the Pacific. And it is riding a historic wave of visitors to Japan, as a weak yen pulls record numbers of tourists through its doors. But the fleet is only half the story. The other half is a group of airlines flying under that same crane that most passengers never even think about. There's Zip Air, a long-haul, low-cost carrier that Japan Airlines launched in 2020, flying stripped-down Dreamliners across the Pacific and into Asia for a fraction of the usual fare, and it is expanding fast. There is Spring Japan, a low-cost carrier the group took control of. There is Jetstar Japan, a budget joint venture, and there is a web of smaller regional airlines beneath them, from Japan Transocean Air down in Okinawa to the little turboprops that stitch together Japan's distant islands. It is an empire built in layers. Full service on top, low cost underneath, all of it feeding the same network. And leading the whole thing is a figure who says everything about how far this airline has traveled. In 2024, Japan Airlines named its first ever female president. Her name is Mitsuko Totori, and she did not come up through finance or government. She started her career on board as a cabin attendant back in 1985. The same year, Flight 123 fell out of the sky. Nearly 40 years later, the woman who began in the aisle was running the entire airline. Which brings us all the way back to that burning airplane. On the 2nd of January, 2024, Japan Airlines Flight 516 was landing at Tokyo's Haneda Airport. Arriving from the north with 367 passengers and 12 crew on board, it was a brand new Airbus A350, barely 2 years old. On the runway ahead of it, in the dark, sat a small Coast Guard Dash 8 that had not been cleared to be there. It was loaded with relief supplies, bound for a region struck by a powerful earthquake the day before. The two aircraft collided. The A350 burst into flames and slid down the runway, trailing fire, then came to rest as smoke began pouring into the cabin. And here is where 40 years of obsession came due. The aircraft's own public address system had failed in the impact. So the cabin crew grabbed megaphones and used their own voices, moving people calmly and firmly toward the handful of exits that still worked. Passengers left everything behind. In roughly 18 minutes, every one of the 379 people on board was off the aircraft and standing on the tarmac as the jet behind them was swallowed whole by fire. Not one of them died. Airlines and investigators around the world studied that evacuation in disbelief. A full, wide-body jet, on fire, emptied in minutes, with no lives lost. It became, almost instantly, a global lesson in how to survive the unsurvivable. On the Coast Guard aircraft, 5 of the 6 people on board were killed, and that loss is real and it is heavy. But the airline that had once given aviation its darkest day had just shown the world its brightest. The same red crane on the tail, 38 years apart, the worst and then the best. So what do you even call an airline like this? Because Japan Airlines is not a simple story of a great airline or a cursed one. It is the airline that made the single worst mistake in the history of the sky and then spent 40 years making certain it would be the one you would most want to be sitting inside when everything went wrong. It died as a bloated national giant and came back as a lean survivor. It was saved by a monk who worked for nothing. And it took the memory of 520 lost lives and turned it into a culture so obsessed with safety that it pulled off the most celebrated escape in modern flight. Here's what I want to know from you. Does a comeback like this erase a past like that? Or does an airline carry both forever, the darkest day and the brightest, on the very same tail? Tell me where you land in the comments, and this is one I really want to hear you argue out. And if you made it all the way to the end of this video, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because this is exactly the kind of story ExPlaned lives for. Thank you for watching this video. Stay safe, healthy, and kind, and I will hopefully see you in the next one.